back home. It was a great holiday. I can't really see this because the sun is behind it, so I hope I'm entirely in the frame. So today is Saturday. I'm back at work on Monday. Monday is also the first day of semester 1 at university, and I'm studying in my evenings, in my spare time. So from Monday I won't have as much time. Plus I had a few appointments that I couldn't do because I was away. Not that that is necessarily relevant to this channel, but I may have to slow down with some of the reading for a few weeks until I've caught up. As you can see, I got to the land of hairdressers. It was kind of nice being in a city again. It was the first time in a year that I've gotten out. I have left the town in the last year, but it was always for work, so I wasn't actually free to go and do anything I chose to. So I made the most of the week that I had. I saw family, I bought things, I bought books, I bought paintings. I'd never really gotten into paintings, but I think I have now. Found a few that I really liked. And I did get to do some reading, which is probably obvious because I've managed to upload a couple of chapters that I did. And on that note, while there's still some sunshine, I will get on and talk about chapter 23. This one was more in the line of chapter that Scott is good at. He wasn't introducing anything new. We were just getting to know Fergus and Flora better. After the last chapter, Fergus's dog had come up to them, so they knew that he was about to arrive. The start of this chapter is his arrival, and the whole thing is a conversation at the waterfall place, and then a walk down to the house again. There's a bit of brotherly sister banter, which I don't find very convincing. I've no idea if people actually talk this way. It may be that Scott is just making it all a little bit more formal than it really was for the sake of making the story grander. I mean, obviously it was going to be different. Speech has changed. The way we use words has changed. But I find Shakespeare's English far more convincing than this. Shakespeare manages to make things sound as if people might have actually said them, as if people might have had a proper conversation using those words, whereas the way these guys talk to each other, it's stunted, it's formal. For instance, Fergus quotes some kind of poem in French, and Flora says, "A truce, dear Fergus, spare us those most tedious and insipid persons of all Arcadia. Do not, for heaven's sake, bring down Corydon and Lindor upon us. If you cannot relish," and it's a string of French, "have with you in heroic strains. Dear Fergus, you have certainly partaken of the inspiration of MacMurrough's cup rather than of mine. I disclaim it, ma belle demoiselle, although I protest it would be the more congenial of the two. Which of your crack-baned Italian romances is it that says," and then there's a bit of Italian. I just don't see them really talking like that. Maybe they did, maybe. It doesn't sound natural. But we get the idea. We get the idea that the brother and sister get on very well. They know each other very well. They've shared influences. They've shared an education. It's all very amicable and they can banter. So to that extent, I accept it. And then Fergus gets Kathleen, the handmaiden, to sing a song in Gaelic, which she does, and then he says, "Admirable Kathleen, I must find you a handsome husband among the clansmen one of these days." Kathleen laughed, blushed, and sheltered herself behind her companion. Fergus is an autocratic man, we know it. I think that's fitting. I think that probably is what he would have said and done. Anyway, they walk back to the castle, and see, he's calling it a castle. Scott calls it a castle, this tower with a lofted house. As they walk back, Edward invites Fergus to stay for a week because he's going to go hunting and he thinks Edward would enjoy it. Edward would like to do this because he's still quite intrigued by Flora. And so they decide that he should stay 2 weeks and he should write a letter to the Baron of Bradwardine, which one of the Highland people will deliver, and that Highland person will bring back any letters that have arrived for Edward. This is the plan. So there's a few little bits here that I'd like to mention. Flora talks about how much respect she has for Tully, and she talks about all the men that we met in the early part. She says, Scottish cavaliers of the old style, of which Tully is one, had self-respect, and that lately, with all the deprivations made on those who have not taken the oath of the new government, a lot of them are treated in a degraded way and have started to act as if that degradation is their rightful lot. But she says Tully hasn't. Tully still has his dignity. Let us hope that a brighter day is approaching when a Scottish country gentleman may be a scholar without the pedantry of our friend the Baron, a sportsman without the low habits of Mr. Falconer, and a judicious improver of his property without becoming a boorish two-legged steer like Killen-Curate. Scott highlights this afterwards too as being Flora's prophecy of a revolution. This is the first actual mention in this book of any kind of coming revolution. It's the first suggestion that somebody might not see the status quo as an ongoing situation. You enter this book knowing that's going to be the case because it's history and because Scott chose this era for a reason. But for those living at the time, so for instance Edward, the real life Edwards of the time, living in England, wouldn't have had a clue about that anybody in the Scottish Highlands might have dreamed of any kind of future change for the better for those who have not taken the oath. It's a little thing, but it's the first step. And then Flora and Edward talk about Rose. Flora says he'll be a lucky man who makes her his wife. She says it in a lot more paragraphs than that, but that's what she says. Her very soul is in home and in the discharge of all those quiet virtues of which home is the centre. Her husband will be to her what her father is now, the object of all her care, solicitude and affection. And if she ends up with a good husband, that's going to be fantastic. But if she becomes the property of a churlish or negligent husband, she will suit his taste also, for she will not long survive his unkindness. And alas, how great is the chance that some such unworthy lot may be that of my poor friend. Oh, if only I was a queen who could command the best man in the kingdom to accept Rose. And then Fergus, maybe as a joke, says, I wish you would command her to accept me. Then there's another interesting sentence here. I don't know by what caprice it was that this wish, however jocularly expressed, rather jarred on Edward's feelings, notwithstanding his growing inclination to Flora and his indifference to Miss Bradwardine. This is one of the inexplicabilities of human nature, which we leave without comment. And then Flora says, You, brother? Regarding him steadily, No, you have another bride, Honour, and the dangers you must run in pursuit of her rival would break poor Rose's heart. And then they arrive back at Glennaquoich. Edward writes his letter to Tully, and when he comes to close it up, he realises that he cannot find his seal. He was about to impress his billet with a seal on which his armorial bearings were engraved, but he did not find it at his watch, and thought he must have left it at Tully Veolan. He mentioned his loss, borrowing at the same time the family seal of the chieftain. Surely, said Miss McKeever, Donald would not. My life for him in such circumstances, answered her brother. Besides, he would never have left the watch behind. What they're saying there is Edward kept his watch and his seal together. He's got his watch, but his seal is missing. Flora is saying, could Donald have stolen it? And Fergus said, no, he wouldn't do that. But if he had stolen it, he would have taken the watch as well. And then Flora says, you know, given everything, I don't know how you can stand that man. I don't like him at all. Fergus says, you'll have Edward thinking he's in my employment. Flora says, no, he won't think that. He's seen how many men you've got. No cause should induce me to tolerate such a character. No cause, Flora, said the chieftain significantly. No cause, Fergus, not even that which is nearest to my heart. I'd much rather you got rid of him. And Fergus says, oh, but sister, you don't consider my respect for la belle passion. Evan du Macombish is in love with Donald's daughter Alex, and you cannot expect me to disturb him in his amours. Why, the whole clan would cry shame on me. A kinsman is part of a man's body, but a foster brother is a piece of his heart, by which I think that makes clear that Evan is a foster brother. So he's not actually a McKeever relation, he is sort of an adopted kinsman. This latter conversation took place in the hall. I knew it was in the castle, but it never really explained where. And at this point, the music has struck up and they dance. So Waverley took Flora's hand. The dance, song and merrymaking proceeded and closed the day's entertainment at the castle of Vicyanvor. Edward at length retired, his mind agitated by a variety of new and conflicting feelings, which detained him from rest for some time in that not unpleasing state of mind in which fancy takes the helm. And he's daydreaming. At a late hour he fell asleep and dreamed of Flora McKeever. And that's the end of chapter 23. Chapter 24. I don't know what to think of this chapter. I liked it, but it was a strange one, and I think Walter Scott found it that way too. He started it off in a very odd way. I can find it. This one was called A Stag Hunt and Its Consequences, and the stag hunt was relevant, yes, but not for itself, only as a catalyst. Now, I've actually heard of this chapter before. Scott begins it in a very odd way, and I'm going to read this opening sentence, or the opening couple of sentences. Shall this be a long or a short chapter? This is a question in which you, gentle reader, have no vote, however much you may be interested in the consequences, just as you may, like myself, probably have nothing to do with the imposing a new tax, excepting the trifling circumstance of being obliged to pay it. More happy surely in the present case, since, though it lies within my arbitrary power to extend my materials as I think proper, I cannot call you into exchequer if you do not think proper to read my narrative. He goes on in this, he talks about how he hasn't really described much about the Highlands in this, but he doesn't need to because there are other people that do so, and he gives a few examples of this. There's somebody who talked about foods in the Highlands, there's somebody else that talked about the clothing. He quotes a bit of a poem by somebody called Taylor. And then he says, but without further tyranny over my readers, I shall content myself with borrowing a single incident. And he says this after giving us several examples. The single incident, I believe, was the poem that he had just quoted us, so then he gets on with it. And then he tells us that the hunting was delayed from various causes for about 3 weeks. So Edward was going to stay here too. He's obliged to stay longer. For some reason, in this time, no letters have come back from Tully for him. But he's not thinking about that. He's very happy spending his time with Fergus and Flora, particularly with Flora. He's lost in all the romance and not really thinking about anything. I mean, Edward never did think about anything anyway, so this is him doubly not thinking about anything. He's not thinking it odd that no mail has come for him. He's not worried about where he might have lost this seal, which is an important thing. It's the seal of a soldier in the Hanoverian army. This is a serious issue that this seal is missing, but this is Edward we're talking about. He's not concerning himself with this at all. He's also not concerning himself with the fact that he had stayed for 6 weeks with the Baron of Bradwardine, and he's now on a short visit away. He was only going away for a day or two, then he was going for a week, and then it was 2 weeks, and now we're up to 3 weeks, and he doesn't feel like he is being rude at all. He clearly isn't being rude by staying here. It's quite obvious that Fergus and Flora are putting themselves out hugely to keep him here, to keep him occupied and entertained. They definitely want him here. There's a page about Flora. Her manners, her language, her talent for poetry and music, her personal charms. Even in her hours of gaiety, she was, in his fancy, exalted above the ordinary daughters of Eve, and seemed only to stoop for an instant to those topics of amusement and gallantry which others appear to live for. In the neighbourhood of this enchantress, while sport consumed the morning and music and the dance led on the hours of evening, Waverley became daily more delighted with his hospitable landlord and more enamoured of his bewitching sister. And I think that yeah, exactly, that's what's going on. The day for the hunting came. It's going to be a day's journey to the north. Waverley and the chieftain departed for the place of rendezvous. Fergus was attended on this occasion by about 300 of his clan, well armed and accoutred in their best fashion, including Evan Dhu, as we find out towards the end of this chapter. But they don't talk to Evan at all. He hasn't gotten a mention in a couple of chapters, which kind of annoys me, because I still like Evan. I still think he is a great character, and Walter Scott should be making more of him. I don't know where he is. He's around. They head off. They travel for the day. Edward is dressed in a sort of half Scottish costume now. He refuses the kilt, but he is wearing trews like Fergus is, brogues and bonnet, as the fittest dress for the exercise in which he was to be engaged, and which least exposed him to be stared at as a stranger. When they got there, they found several powerful chiefs, to all of whom Waverley was formally presented. All of these chiefs have brought their vassals and clansmen, and they've brought pretty much as Fergus, so they appeared in such numbers as amounted to a small army. What they do is, the clansmen go out into the bush as far away as they can, and they drive the deer in to this point. And when they drive the deer in, the deer will be shot by the chieftains and the more senior people. The clansmen head off. It's going to take them about 24 hours, apparently, from the distance out that they're going to go, and they're going to sort of form a circle. They seem to know what they're doing. The ones who are not going out, the chieftains who are waiting to actually do the kill, they just sort of sit around and bonfires, they talk in little groups, they wait, and then they wrap themselves in their plaids at night by the fire and sleep. It's a summer night, and apparently it's very pleasant. Edward quite enjoys this. For many hours after sunrise, the mountain ridges and passes retained their ordinary appearance of silence and solitude, and the chiefs with their followers amused themselves with various pastimes, in which the joys of the shell, as Ossian had it, were not forgotten. Which means they do a lot of drinking, I think, because it seems like the shell are what they carry their whiskey in. Others apart sate on the hill retired. At length signals of the approach of the game were descried and heard. Distant shouts resounded from valley to valley as the various parties of Highlanders, climbing rocks, struggling through copses, wading brooks and traversing thickets, approached more and more near to each other and compelled the astonished deer with the other wild animals that fled before them into a narrower circuit. So this is sort of a strange thing. Like that much I quite understand. I see what's going on. They sometimes use their muskets to make sure that the deer go in the right direction, and when they do, the musket fire echoes around the place. At length the advanced parties of the deer began to show themselves, and as the stragglers came bounding down the pass, by 2 or 3 at a time, the chiefs showed their skill by distinguishing the fattest deer, and their dexterity in bringing them down with their guns. Fergus exhibited remarkable address, and Edward was also so fortunate as to attract the notice and applause of the sportsmen. Okay, so up to here I'm still with it. But now the main body of the deer appeared at the head of the glen, compelled into a very narrow compass, and presenting such a formidable phalanx that their antlers appeared at a distance over the ridge of the steep pass like a leafless grove. Their number was very great, so we've got this massive stampede. And from a desperate stand which they made with the tallest of the red deer stags arranged in front in a sort of battle array, gazing on the group which barred their passage down the glen, the more experienced sportsmen began to augur danger. The work of destruction, however, now commenced on all sides, so like they're shooting at the deer. Dogs and hunters were at work, and muskets resounded from every quarter. The deer, driven to desperation, made at length a fearful charge right upon the spot which the more distinguished sportsmen had taken their stand. Now, this is something that the chieftains expected, but Edward didn't, because he's never seen this sort of thing done. The word was given in Gaelic to fling themselves upon their faces, but Waverley, on whose English ears the signal was lost, had almost fallen a sacrifice to his ignorance of the ancient language. Fergus, observing his danger, sprung up and pulled him with violence to the ground, just as the whole herd broke upon them. The tide being absolutely irresistible, and wounds from a stag's horn highly dangerous, the activity of the chieftain may be considered as having saved his guest's life. He detained him with a firm grasp until the whole herd of deer had fairly run them over. Waverley then attempted to rise, but found that he had suffered several very severe contusions, and upon a further examination discovered that he had sprained his ankle violently. Okay, so that's a dramatic scene. Why didn't Fergus see this coming? My theory is that this is sort of deliberate, although I don't see why you would go to these lengths. When I first read it, I was thinking, surely he'd have thought of this. Surely this is something that he would have warned Edward about. Now I'm thinking maybe not. Like, maybe this wasn't actually a common occurrence. It was just something that happened every so often. So maybe it does make more sense than I'm thinking that Fergus wouldn't have told Edward. It may not even have occurred to him that Edward wouldn't know about this. But no, that doesn't hold, because Fergus was raised in France. He would never have seen this. He has come to the Highlands himself as a newcomer, not in the same circumstances, but when he came over here, he wouldn't have known this. He would know what it's like to be an outsider here. It has to be deliberate, but I don't see why. I don't see... It's a very elaborate way to injure somebody. Anyway, Edward is now injured. They've erected some kind of little tent, and a Scottish healing man has come and used some herbs. Actually, this struck me. I am going to talk about this one. The surgeon, or he who assumed the office, appeared to unite the characteristics of a leech and a conjurer. He observed great ceremony in approaching Edward. The medicine man let his patient's blood with a cupping glass with great dexterity, and proceeded, muttering all the while to himself in Gaelic, to boil on the fire certain herbs, with which he compounded an embrocation. He then fermented the parts which had sustained injury, never failing to murmur prayers or spells, which of the two Waverley could not distinguish. The fermentation had a speedy effect in alleviating the pain and swelling, which our hero imputed to the virtue of the herbs, or the effect of the chafing. Edward was given to understand that not one of the ingredients had been gathered except during the full moon, and that the herbalist had, while collecting them, uniformly recited a charm, which is written in here. This reminded me again of Lord of the Rings. There is so much that pops up in this book that I feel like is in there, which is fine. Like, that's not a criticism of either. I think Tolkien has done an amazing thing if he actually found as much magic in this book as he managed to put into his. But they're very similar situations. Walter Scott is so prosy that he destroys all his own big moments. There's no impact to any of the wonderful situations he creates just because of the way he writes about it. But the scenes are there. A lot of similar stuff happening. And this is another one, this healing a wound with herbs. Anyway, Edward spends the next day in a drugged sleep, which is the effect of the herbs apparently, and when everybody else is finished doing whatever they're doing, which I presume they're like chopping up the dead food and loading it onto their horses or whatever, they're finishing off the hunt, it's discovered that Edward isn't actually well enough to ride. So they create what they call a litter. They just sort of create a sort of stretcher for him, and 4 clansmen carry it. And they set off. And all the chieftains are setting off as well. Apparently they're not going straight back to Glennaquoich. Fergus has something else he needs to do. So he said he's going to take Edward to a nearby place, the residence of a Scottish gentleman who is some kind of kinsman of his. Edward can wait there while Fergus goes off. It'll be a day or two, he says, and he will go off and do what he has to do. Then he'll come back, and hopefully by the time he's back, Edward will be healed enough to actually ride a horse home. Waverley was rather surprised that Fergus had not mentioned this ulterior destination when they set out upon the hunting party, but his situation did not admit of many interrogatories. Which is true, maybe he's starting to learn. He hasn't borne this pain manfully. He has been complaining and groaning and suffering terribly from the agony. So, I don't know. I can't imagine they're viewing him with very much respect at this point. But he is finally learning to, hold his mouth every so often, which is good. The rest of the clansmen carry on to where they're going, and Evan Dhu leads them, which is the first mention of Evan, which is why I know that he's here all this time. There's been no mention of him whatsoever, but he's now going to lead the 300 clans people that Fergus brought on to wherever they're going now. Fergus is going with Edward to introduce him to this gentleman, and there's a few men going with them as attendants of Fergus. So they get to this house, and it's an old man. He's 70 years old. The place is called Tomenrate. I'm not actually sure what this man's name is. All it says is a gentleman related to Fergus. It doesn't give his name anywhere that I can see. It does say he lived a very simple life. He wore no dress but what his estate afforded. The cloth was the fleece of his own sheep, woven by his own servants, and stained into tartan by the dyes produced from the herbs and lichens of the hills around him. His linen was spun by his daughters and maidservants from his own flax. Nor did his table, though plentiful and varied with game and fish, offer an article but what was of native produce. He's very attentive to Edward. So Edward is there for 6 days, which Scott sort of glosses over. We can presume it's not important then. And by the 6th day, he's actually able to walk around with the help of a stick. At the end of the day of his arrival, Edward goes to bed, and when he wakes up in the morning, Fergus has left. He asks one of the Scottish people there where he's gone, where Fergus has gone, and he doesn't get an answer. And being typical Edward, who can't recognise a hint, he pushes it. And he gets told, rather pertly, as Edward thought, that there's a whole lot of weird kind of pidgin English Gaelic, which basically translates as, he should disoblige his friend by inquiring of a stranger the object of a journey which he himself had not communicated. So basically, don't ask. It's a bit rude of you to ask me when your friend didn't choose to tell you himself. Edward is there for 6 days, which Scott sort of glosses over. We can presume it's not important then. And by the 6th day, he's actually able to walk around with the help of a stick. When Fergus came back, he was in the highest of spirits and very pleased to find that Edward could ride a horse, and he suggested they leave straight away for Glennaquoich. Waverley joyfully acceded, for the form of his fair mistress had lived in his dreams during all the time of his confinement. So they get back to Glennaquoich. Flora welcomed Waverley with much kindness, expressed her regret for his accident, of which she had already heard the particulars, and expressed her surprise that her brother should not have taken better care to put a stranger on his guard against the perils of the sport, which is just what I thought. I really don't see how it happened at all. And Edward then said, well, Fergus saved my life. So if he did anything wrong, he put it right. This greeting over, Fergus said 3 or 4 words to his sister in Gaelic. The tears instantly sprang to her eyes, but they seemed to be tears of devotion and joy, for she looked up to heaven and folded her hands, as in a solemn expression of prayer or gratitude. After the pause of a minute, she presented to Edward some letters which had been forwarded from Tully Veolan during his absence, and delivered other letters to her brother. Both gentlemen retired to examine their dispatches, and Edward speedily found that those which he had received contained matters of very deep interest. And that's the end of the chapter. Now, I didn't really say much at the end of the last chapter. There wasn't really much to say, but I feel like it's time. This chapter has changed a great deal. It was a good one again, because Edward didn't go, well, he did go somewhere new, but he went somewhere new with people that he'd already met. And although there were other people there, we weren't introduced to them, so I think that was handled quite well. But although a lot happened in this chapter, and I have inferred a lot from this chapter, we weren't told it by Scott, and we weren't told through the story. Nothing occurred that we could use to confirm anything. And I don't know how to approach it, because up until now I have been approaching the work as somebody who doesn't know what's going to happen. I haven't read this before. This is my first read through. As I said before, I believe Bonnie Prince Charlie is in here somewhere. And inevitably that means a conflict. It's also pretty obvious that Fergus has an army here. He's holding on to some men. He's collecting as many men as he can. They're sending themselves positively bankrupt doing this. They're starving themselves in order to keep as many men gathered as they can. He's raising his own army. Well, basically, he's got his own army. He's just hanging on to it and waiting. Now, Scott hasn't told us anything about that, and when I read a book, I like to follow whatever cues the author is giving me. Like, ideally, you don't see much of the author in a book. And I know that they are always present as an omniscient narrator in this era. You will always get some little speech directly from the author to the reader. But all the same, they are presenting a story, and I like to stay with that story. I like to follow the path that they're leading me along. I don't know what that is in this chapter. I don't know if the things that I am inferring from this chapter are things that Walter Scott is telling me, or if I'm only inferring them because I have some knowledge of history already. It's pretty clear to me that what happened was that this hunt was not just a hunt. This was a cover for all the chiefs to get together to discuss military plans. It's quite obvious. It also seems likely that when Fergus went away and left Edward at that old gentleman's house, he did that because I'm guessing it is the arrival of Jacobite troops from France, especially given Flora's reaction when Fergus said whatever he said in those few Gaelic words at the end. That's what I'm thinking. This is the start of an uprising. The Scottish Jacobites are collecting their forces. There's basically a secret army here, and maybe James the Old Pretender or his son Charles has just landed with other forces somewhere on the west coast of Scotland. This is my guess. But as I said, I don't know if I'm getting that because Walter Scott is telling me, the reader, that, or if I'm not meant to know that yet. So I'm not really sure how to follow this. And that bugs me. The other side of it is, I haven't completely studied the history of this event. I don't exactly know what happens. It might be that Scott is presuming I understand a lot more than I really do. But I wish he'd tell us. We are seeing everything through the head of the most clueless main character you could ever imagine. He doesn't see what's right under his nose. Maybe that is meant to be humour. Maybe it's meant to be that we're in the know. We're supposed to feel superior to him because we understand what's going on and he doesn't. Or maybe we are just meant to be sitting in his position, not having a clue. So my guess as to what happened in this chapter is that when Fergus and Edward got to the hunt, which was going to be some kind of a military conference, Fergus learned that one of the Old Pretender's generals was arriving with troops, and he therefore wanted to go and meet him, and he had to do something with Edward because he couldn't let Edward come along. So I'm wondering if, when he threw Edward to the ground and pinned him down until the deer ran over them, maybe he actually injured him himself. Maybe he took that opportunity to break his ankle or bruise his ankle very badly himself so that Edward would have to stay there. It's entirely possible. I wish I knew. I'd like that. I'd like that to have happened. I feel like that would be a suitable intrigue. But I wish we knew. I wish Scott was telling us anything about that. All the times that he does jump in and just tells us exactly what's going on, it makes it very hard to deal with the times that he doesn't. Because that seems like a very major point if that's what happened. I think that's it. I think the story's going very well. There's been a lot of events. It was a big chapter. I don't know why Scott started it that way. having this whole page and a half on how long this chapter might or might not be and what we might or might not think of it. It was a good chapter, and it will be interesting to see what comes next.